I'll give kind of the intro here to what we're doing. Get the right screen going on. There we go. Um, no, that's the wrong one. Lord of mercy. Come on, there we go. I don't know why I have so much problem with this. I don't usually have problems with it otherwise, getting the right screens in the right places. But for this class, it's always challenging. Um, so what we'll do tonight is we're going to talk about basically structural stuff. Um, and how the church is structured as a denomination, how it is structured within, in terms of the hierarchy, all of that kind of stuff. And frustrating. And then we'll talk about where does the church go? And if I can get my cursor to behave, this will be a whole lot easier, but it's not. So, all right,
Impressed you can manage slides at all.
let's
That's
just let's just do this. See
that's
if I
right.
can start over here. Let's get this down here. And,
PowerPoint just kind of passed me by.
nothing's working. All right, but I want to get my face in the camera in the same place, and I can't get the cursor to be where I can control it.
Well, we can see your face and we can see
Well, we lost
slide
you.
1 and 2.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Now we see you.
Okay. Well, I'll figure it out. Yeah. I just don't understand. So tonight I'll ask the question I always ask is, do we have any questions from last time? Or any of the other weeks that we've been gathered? Any new questions?
I don't have new questions. We bought a book of common prayer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, I like it, but I'm not. When I was reading the Episcopal book, it made it sound like and even last week, it seemed like so easy. I was going to be able to turn and there'd be the evening song, there'd be the morning thing, and I'm not finding it quite as easy to find. But I'm sure I'll become more familiar with it as I seem
Yeah,
to keep getting caught up in actual services.
right. And I think I sent out a few weeks ago a link to a program I did at church on how to do the daily office at least, and that
Mhm.
helps you negotiate some of that stuff. Um, I'll send it out again.
Thank you.
Okay.
You
Yeah.
know,
We would greatly appreciate
Yeah.
that.
yeah. If you grew up an Episcopalian, especially in the old days, you were using a lot of the book. I mean, and even until about 15 years ago, you were still opening the book all the time because everything wasn't printed in a leaflet. And so, we can think about this in terms of mission going on towards the end of tonight's discussion is when you're new to the Episcopal Church, you have a bulletin and you have a prayer book and you have a hymnal. And so it's this juggling act of what do you hold when, and how do you get to one place in time, so you haven't missed the first verse of the hymn while you're still looking for it, or all of these other things. And so most churches now have gone to something like we have, where a lot of the service is printed in, all of the text and everything else is printed in the bulletin. And so you're only juggling the bulletin and the hymnal.
Yeah.
Well, there are other churches that have all of the hymns printed in it, so the only thing you've got is the bulletin, and it has everything that you need to sing or say in it. Well, which I think is fine, and I understand that for newcomers, but people don't know everything that's in the book. And it's not that you need to know what's in the book, but there are a lot of things that are in the book that are really valuable that, people discover when the sermon gets boring, right? You flip through and you find those kinds of things. Um, or you recognize that when you open the prayer book, the Eucharistic service, right two, is almost right in the middle. So you open it up. It's not at the beginning, it's in the middle because that's where most people turn. And if you go to a church where the prayer book is used a lot, and I don't mean the service, but the actual book is used a lot, you'll see this gray edges at the middle of the book where the Eucharistic service is because of everybody's thumb oil, coming off on the edges. Well, I haven't been in the pews in Good Shepherd for a long time, so I haven't looked at the prayer books. But I doubt that that's quite the case as it would be in some other churches that don't print everything for you. Um, it's not like one thing is better than the other. One works well for people who are accustomed to using the books, all of the books. One works well or better for people who are newcomers. So it's a juggling thing. And probably refer to this a little bit more in a few minutes, but we revised this prayer book. This prayer book was revised, the 79 book that's in the pews, in 1979. That's almost 50 years ago. They were revising it in the mid 70s. So that was 50 years ago. And the book before that was the 1928. Well, 28 to 78 was 50 years. And there was a major, that the revision between 28 and 79 was a major revision. And there have been a lot of things that people have suggested we should do with the new one. But now the discussion at General Convention is, do we want to create a new book, physical book, and make every church buy them when probably most churches aren't using the book? They're using something digital, whether it's a screen or they're printing off individual worship books. That's a big discussion to be having. So, the fact that you're not finding it as self-evident as you might thought it would be is exactly part of the discussion that the church is going through right now. And then the other thing is that we're not using as much of the book as we used to. Many churches would use morning prayer a couple of Sundays a month and then use the Eucharist. Well, that at least gets you in the front of the book and then in the middle of the book. And of course, if you're reading the Psalms, then you're going to the second half of the book to find the Psalm. So you're using more of the book. But if we're only doing the Eucharist, then you're not reading morning prayer. You don't see how all of that works. And you're not going to the Psalter as much. So it's a catch-22, and I don't know how we're going to answer that, but that's a great observation, great question. Thank you.
I found that if you get there early, you can mark all the pages in the hymnal.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and
Well,
then I was going to also say, back in the day when the prayer book was used more, there was this bookmark that went in the spine and it had colored ribbons. And so you could go through ahead of time and mark all the pages. And you could still do that today to mark the pages that you want to see. Yeah, there you go with the colored
there we
ribbons.
go.
Oh, the one
So
I bought didn't come with anything.
no, and now I have to go and buy the ribbons and stick them in the
Gotcha.
spine.
Okay.
But these are just marked for morning prayer.
Well,
Mhm.
so
Well,
You know,
that's
do a,
so this well, actually morning and evening prayer. My red one is morning prayer.
ah,
Yellow one is evening prayer. Blue one is noonday, which I hardly ever use because I'm hardly ever at home. The green one is the daily office lectionary, and the purple one is the collect of the day. So I have a mark to suit me so
that's
that I
good.
can use it every day without having to lurk at the pages and all of that. Everything
right.
just sort of moves. But if you look at that, like I say, I'll send out the instructions, that the thing that I did on the daily office, because that's how most of the time, unless you're using it during the church service, and we print the pages,
Right.
you know, so that might be another way to do it, is just sort of follow the pages and see at least how the Eucharistic thing moves,
Right.
uh, and all of that. So it's a great question.
Do Episcopalians typically have their own book of common prayer that they bring to service, or do you always, is it like being given your first Bible at confirmation? You leave it at home and still expect church to provide everything you need?
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay.
to both questions.
Okay. Thank you. That was
Um, I remember going to the cathedral when I first started going to the cathedral downtown. There was a gentleman who walked in every Sunday with his really large Book of Common Prayer that also has, this is hard to do, also has the hymns in it,
okay.
Oh, okay.
you know, and you know, so this is what a lot of clergy carry, so they don't have to carry two books.
Okay.
But then this is the one, this is the size that I have at home.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
it's both and you know, I don't think that it has anything to do with questions of piety or anything like that. It's just personal preference. Personal preference. So great. All right. So we've talked about worship and prayer, just like we just did. We've talked about the Bible. We've talked about history and how we think as Episcopalians, Anglicans. So now we want to talk about how we run ourselves. How does the church work as an institution, for better or for worse? And so I like to start with worship. Um, and my the sort of subtitle there is who stands where and why. And this, in some churches, this is much more apparent than it is at Good Shepherd, because, we don't have all of these various um, leadership roles at play at the same time. But in some larger churches, if you go to the cathedral, for example, you'll see a lot of different people wearing different stuff. And what you normally see at Good Shepherd is Nadine and me, and we're wearing different stuff, but it's pretty subtle. But it says something about stuff. And so, you know, we talk about what are known as the orders of ministry. And the primary ones are the bishop, priest, and deacon, except that everybody who is baptized by virtue of their baptism is ordained into the ministry of the baptized, which when we read, we'll talk about that again in a little bit, but when we read the baptismal covenant, the vows that we make at baptism, those apply to everybody, whether you've got a piece of plastic around your neck or not. They apply to everybody. So the orders, the way that what we're talking about, bishop, priest, deacon, are distinct, but they overlap, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But all are ministers by virtue of their baptism. It's just that the clergy are called to special ministries in the church, just as lay folks might be called to special ministries. Connie, she's a minister of music, if nothing else, right? And she does a lot of stuff beside that, but she's called to music ministry. It's not an ordained ministry, but it is a ministry. The Eucharistic ministers and the lectors are called to those ministries. They've understood that God gave them a gift, maybe of reading or whatever, and they exercise that gift as a layperson. But it's not the same as what a deacon or a priest or a bishop can do. And so at various ordination services for those three orders, the description of what they do is a little bit different. They overlap. You don't lose one thing when you become the other thing. When you move up the ladder, you keep all of that stuff. So it's sort of a cumulative thing. And excuse me, I think this was spelled out pretty well in the book on page 100. Yeah, the Book of Common Prayer makes this, I'm just going to read this to you, makes it clear that lay ministry comes first, and that the other orders are there to support lay ministers. Although it's been traditional to speak of the three orders of ordained ministry, now we really think that baptism is the ordination of lay people. That we've already talked about that. So when Christians gather for worship, and a bishop is present, it's the bishop who presides. We'll see that in a couple of months. And it is the bishop who ordains others to carry on the ministries in the local communities. So in the ancient church, there was probably one bishop per church. And then congregations grew, and then one bishop had to go to between the churches. And so there had to be somebody in, to conduct services while the bishop wasn't there. Priests are those who serve primarily in parishes, presiding at the Eucharist, baptizing, teaching, preaching, and supporting the lay people. Deacons, like that of lay people, has been neglected, but their role is as a servant of those who are in need. Now, they've got liturgical roles, which is usually, as Nadine does, read the gospel, call people to confession, dismiss the people. In some churches, it's the deacons who read the prayers of the people. But not every church in the Episcopal Church, and certainly not in Colorado, has a deacon. So a lot of these things get taken up by lay folk. And in fact, when I first arrived at Good Shepherd, we did not have a deacon. It took us several years. Nadine came sort of towards the end of COVID. And so I petitioned the bishop. I said, we've got a lot of people. We don't have very many clergy. Is it okay if the lay Eucharistic ministers, who are the folks who hold the chalice, can they distribute the bread? If we believe that, the bread and the wine, in either one of those, Christ is truly present in the bread and the wine, what difference does it make whether they're distributing the bread or the wine? And the bishop said, sure, that's fine. Do it. And so, that's, I don't want to say we pioneered that, but I certainly pressed for that. So that it wasn't just me handing out the bread by myself, that there were other people up there able to do it. And that was an empowerment, it seemed to me, on the way that I was thinking, an empowerment of the lay ministries as well. Passing out bread and wine doesn't seem to be something that should theoretically be reserved to one person. Blessing the bread and wine, that's what you ordain people for, is to bless things. So anyway, so how did all this happen? You see this developing in the course of the New Testament, over the course of the New Testament. And so if we think that Jesus died, was buried and resurrected in the early part of the 30s of the first century, the New Testament represents basically the next 100 years of the history of the church. And we can see how the orders of ministry developed over those 100 years. So in the New Testament, in the Gospels, we see references to priests and rabbis. Those were kind of I don't want to say they were the orders in Judaism. They fulfilled different functions. The priests did the liturgical stuff, the sacrifices and all that kind of stuff. And the rabbis did the teaching. Priests would be in the temple, rabbis would be in the synagogue. So we hear references to those two different ways that I'll call them clergy among the Jews, how they functioned. So we've got that class of folk that are part and referenced in the New Testament. Then we've got Jesus chose 12 guys to follow him and to help him do his ministry. So we've got the apostles. Well, we start to learn in the book of Acts. So shortly after Jesus died, this is where Acts picks up. We hear about deacons. And what was happening was that in the church in Jerusalem, there were Jewish Christians, and then there were people who had become Christians who may have been converts to Judaism. They were Greeks and converts. So they weren't full Jews. They were Greek Jews become Christians. And there was an argument in the church that was saying that these other people, not these Jewish Christians, but these other people were sort of getting sidelined in the distribution of charity or of food or things like that. And the church decided that they were going to, the apostles decided they didn't want to get mixed up in this. And so they appointed deacons, which just means servants, to oversee all of this stuff. So very early on, we had this order called deacons. There's a reference in the book of Acts to Philip the evangelist. There are some scholars who say there was an order of evangelists, people who went out and spread the word. the apostles are running the church. The deacons are making sure that the goods of the church are equally distributed. And then there are evangelists who are going out and spreading the word. And then we hear throughout the New Testament other what I would call charismatic ministries. These are gifts or ministries of gifts. So you are given the gift to be a prophet, to interpret the world in terms of God, or to teach, or to heal. These are specific ministries that the church recognized, ministries where you are given the gift of doing that particular task. Later on, we read in the book of Acts about elders. And the word there is presbyter in Greek, which gets translated into priest. In one way of thinking about it, also gets translated into elder. And so the Presbyterians don't talk about priests, but they talk about elders, and their church is run by elders. So it is a Presbyterian or an elder-run church. In the Episcopal Church, I'm still a presbyter, but I'm not a presbyter as the Presbyterians understand it. So a lot of this just has to do with how words get translated and then how the clergy function in those ways. And then in Philippians, so Philippians is still early. Philippians was written by Paul, one of his earlier books. So this is in the 50s, 25 years after Jesus died. Church is growing. And who's watching over it? So Paul talks about the episkopoi. We translate that as bishop, but all it really means is overseer. So we translate it, it can be translated bishops, and that's the language that worked its way up through the history to the Episcopal Church, that being the church that is run by the episkopoi, the bishops, or the overseers. Different way of looking at it as opposed to the elders. Does it make a big difference? I don't know, but it has made a big difference over the centuries. And then late in the New Testament, these books of Titus and First Timothy that are at the very end of the first century, maybe even to the second century, there are a couple of places there in First Titus or in Titus and First Timothy where bishops, priests, and deacons are all referred to like in the same passage. So by the end of the first century, we had this differentiation between these people who were leading the churches. And that's kind of where, if we think about the New Testament, those are the things that contribute to our jumping off point. So any questions up to this point? Because it's going to get complicated here in a minute.
Better go fast then.
So, like I say, Presbyterians, if I was a Presbyterian, I would have been ordained an elder. If I was a Methodist, I would be ordained as an elder. It's in the Episcopal Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Orthodox Church that people in my position are called priests. And some of that's a theological distinction about what do we do. And other parts of it are an issue of translation of the Greek. So.
How does the word pastor then come and relates to all of these then?
Okay.
Is it a deacon? Is it a priest? I don't know, it's not a bishop, but I was just wondering, is it more associated with the priest or a deacon?
So pastor is a translation, or actually it's a transliteration. It's the same. It's the word for, you think about the English word pasture, which is where sheep are. So the pastor is the person who watches over the sheep.
Ah.
So it's a pastoral role. I'm called to give pastoral care. That's taking care of my sheep, right? Whether I'm a good shepherd or someplace else. But so in some churches, the head clergy person might be called Pastor Rob, and so I've answered to that summons before. People have said, well, Pastor Gary. In fact, when I first got to Good Shepherd, this is more than you want to know, I was there as the priest in charge which meant, I had all the responsibility and none of the tenure. And people didn't understand that. And so I had on my door, my office door, I had the word pastor because everybody understands that. When I was no longer the priest in charge, and we'll talk about this a little bit in a minute, and I became the rector, I had full charge. I had all the responsibility and tenure. Um, and so I changed the title on my door. That wasn't so much about me and titles. It was to try to tell people how to understand my role. So pastor is really a person who cares for the sheep. If you think about priest, it's somebody who does all of the special magic hands up at the altar. Those are different kinds of things. And so, and that's a theological difference in understanding of ordination between some Protestant churches and other Protestant churches. So it's a really great question. Well, like I said, then it gets complicated. You got the guy in the middle, who's a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church, and you've got these two guys on either side who are some kind of clergy folk in probably the late medieval, early Reformation period. They've got the red hat with the little things dangling. So the clothing begins to say something about who you are. And so we're going to talk a little bit about not so much clothing, but historical developments. So we talked a minute ago about the bishop, priest, and deacon. And this picture here is sort of how one in probably up until about maybe 200 years ago moved to become at least a priest, if not a bishop. So there on the left, you've got this guy who's got this little white patch on the back of his head. That's the tonsure, if you can see it. It's really on the left. That shows that he's interested in moving up the ranks, but he's still outside the door, right? You see the door there.
Yeah.
And then on the right side of that arch, I don't know if you can read that down at the bottom, it says porter, the doorkeeper. So that's the first thing that in antiquity or in the Middle Ages, first thing that you did if you wanted to move up the ranks, you were a porter. Then you became a reader. You could actually read the lessons in worship. And the title there is lector. And that's what we call the people who read at Good Shepherd, is lectors. Then there's an order that's called the exorcist. And, we have to sort of spin that past the 1970s movie and all of that. This is, sort of a healer, something that's going to help you move out of your sort of your bad juju into sort of something else. But I will say, that order of exorcist, and if you saw the movie or you know enough about it, you have all of these associations. But we have a book, it's not the prayer book, but there's a book called the Book of Occasional Services. And these are things that are done every so often. Maybe once a year or once every 5 years or something like that. So, how do you install a new clergy person? That doesn't happen every week. It doesn't happen so we're not going to put it in the prayer book. Well, there's a section, a page in the prayer book, or not in the prayer book, in the Book of Occasional Offices about exorcism. And it says, if you want to do this, talk to the bishop. And the bishop gets to decide how this is going to handle. But it's not absolutely foreign. It's certainly much more foreign than the things that are in the prayer book, but not absolutely outside the prayer book. Well, then you move up to that, from that, and you can become an acolyte. And these are the people who carry the cross, carry the candles, may carry the gospel book, a banner, a flag, or something like this. They're involved in worship, and you're learning how all of the structure of worship happens. Moving up from that, you would become a subdeacon, and you can see all of these people have different clothing. If you look really carefully, you'll see that the clothing gets a little more elaborate each time you move up a step. And the steps are there for reasons too. So we're now at the level of subdeacon, which is 3 down from the left. and he's holding the book at sort of an angle. There are some churches in the Episcopal Church that still do this. They have a subdeacon who might be a lector, might read one of the lessons. Then you move up another step and you're a deacon. And this is where we start to identify with this. And it's hard to see in this drawing, but a lot of times the deacon will have a particular outer garment that's called a dalmatic, and it has a couple of stripes across the front. The subdeacons will only have one stripe across the front. It's all about, stripes and all these kinds of things. You can tell the players by what they're wearing. The deacon holding the book there says Evangelium. It's hard to read that, but they proclaim the gospel. And so that's why Nadine reads the gospel in my absence, or if she's there. In her absence, I read the gospel because even though I'm a priest, I was ordained a deacon. I'm always a deacon, just like I will always be a priest. And then the priest is at the top of that stair step configuration. This is the way it works in churches, individual churches. And then the bishop is beyond all of that. Now, in some churches, you will see various steps leading up to the altar. And I've been in them and I've seen this, that the priest stands at the top step, the deacon stands one step down, and the subdeacon stands one step down. And all facing the altar. This is old school stuff. But this is the history of where we've come from. That all of these things developed over the course of centuries, and now we basically don't have subdeacons, acolytes, exorcists, lectors, doorkeepers in quite the same way that worked several hundred years ago, but we still have deacons, priests, and bishops. And we all have different roles, as I've said. And if you go to the prayer book that you have, and you go sort of past, let's see, I'll tell you what pages you can start on. 511. And it starts with the ordination of the bishop, and after that, the ordination of the priest, and then after that, the ordination of a deacon. And in there, it will describe, you will read, if you read the prayers, read the questions and answers, you'll see how we understand the difference between all of those orders. We do have different jobs to play in the church. So any questions about that before we move to some greater structural issues? Okay. So now I'm going to move from who does what in a congregation or even in a diocese. So Bishop Kim, her office is downtown at basically 13th and Washington, down at, it's not in the cathedral, it's in the building next to the cathedral. So that's where she is, where the bishop's office is. And then the bishop deputizes priests, sometimes deacons, but mostly priests, to preside, to take care of individual congregations. If you're lucky, you get a deacon. We just don't have enough deacons. It's not a paid position. It's basically something that people feel called to do. They've had experience in doing some of that stuff in the past. Nadine is a social worker, so being and serving the public is something that she did professionally. Now, as semi-retired, she functions liturgically and she does a lot of that stuff on behalf of the church. There are some places where the deacon is paid, but it's unusual. So often the paid folks are at the bishop's office, and then priests or associate priests in congregations. I'm the only paid priest at Good Shepherd. We have some others who are retired and volunteer to help out. Nadine is not paid, and we've got two bishops that hang out at Good Shepherd. They're retired. They're not paid. So I'm the paid, basically the paid person. So we are as we talked about throughout these last several weeks, we are Episcopalians, but we are part of the Anglican Communion. So this picture that you're looking at, once every 10 years, the Archbishop of Canterbury invites all of the bishops, all of the active, not retired, all of the active bishops to come to his palace, Lambeth Palace, for a set of conversations. And it's not a legislative session or anything like that. It's sharing experiences. So this picture, I don't think was the last Lambeth conference, but probably the previous one. So you can see how many they are. They're from all over the world. And if you've got a decent screen, you can look at them and you can see how many of those faces are white and how many of them are not. And that is an indication of the way that the church is global and where the church is growing and active. And so there, it's more than half of the faces are not black, are not white, whether they're African American or Asian. And I don't mean African American, African or Asian, or South American. They are not white, but they all link up to the Anglican Communion. And so what that means is, what the Anglican Communion means is that those churches, and they're usually national churches, are in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury. So if you're from the Church of South India or the Church of South Africa or the Church in Nigeria or Australia or Japan or the United States, you could go to Canterbury Cathedral and you could receive communion. You were eating at the same table as the Archbishop of Canterbury. That's basically what that means. I guess that picture, I don't think that picture was from 22. I don't think there was quite that much representation in 2022. But there are a lot of groups, churches, that have pulled away from the Anglican Communion. And this is relatively recent. And so they aren't in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury, but they look very Episcopalian, and they may say Anglican on the sign outside their door. And so I'm going to talk about three different groups here. There's the Anglican Church of America, the ACA. That's old. They split when we moved from the 1928 prayer book to the 1979 prayer book. They didn't like the theology that was inherent in the 1979 prayer book. They didn't like the language that was inherent in the 1979 prayer book. So they split off. There are probably 5,000 of them in the United States right now. Then there was the Anglican Catholic Church, the ACC, that split off because of the ordination of women. So when the Episcopal Church started ordaining women, this group split off. There are about 35,000 of them in the United States right now. And there's an Anglican Catholic Church in Denver, over near the University of Denver. So if you get off the freeway and head west on Iliff, after you cross Colorado and before you get to University Boulevard, there's a church on the right-hand side that's St. Mary's Anglican Catholic Church. And that's one of this group. Huh. Then there's a group in the United States that's called the Anglican Church of North America. And there are about 120,000 of them. And depending on the church, they may ordain women or they may not. It's kind of local choice. They're pretty evangelical, much more conservative than the Episcopal Church. And they split off for any number of reasons. And we have one of those that's just right down the street from where I live, and Heather knows exactly where it is. Resurrection Anglican Fellowship It's on Bellevue, between Dayton and Yosemite. It's just up the street from the King Soopers shopping center there on Yosemite and Bellevue. Just right up the street from that is the Resurrection Anglican Fellowship. And coincidentally, the pastor there was associated many years ago with Good Shepherd.
Huh.
And then he decided that the direction of the Episcopal Church was not a direction that he felt comfortable with and pulled out. So I've never met him. I've never been to that church, even though I drive by it many times a week. So there are about 120,000 of those. And then there's this group that is known now as GAFCON, the Global Anglican Futures Conference. And it's made up of many different Anglican groups. Some of them are national churches, some of them are local. But the reason that they've really split off from kind of the mainstream Anglican communion is over the ordination of LGBTQ people. So they're out there. They're not in communion right now with the Archbishop of Canterbury, but they call themselves Anglican. So it's really complicated. It's really confusing. But 90% of the time, if you see a sign on a church that says Anglican, that's sort of the sign that says they aren't part of the Episcopal Church. They are part of something that has roots in the Anglican tradition, but aren't part of the Episcopal Church in the United States. Now, some of these groups, Anglican Church of North America, or have real significant ties to churches in Africa. And so African churches are sending missionaries to the United States as a mission field. So, like I say, it's really, really complicated and confusing. And unless you've lived through all of this, most of it doesn't make sense. But I'm watching some churches step away, and some of the people that I went to seminary with, and I graduated in 1981, some of them became parts of some of these other churches. So it's, like I say, it's complicated.
So what were the main reasons that the ACNA split away? Was it the woman issue? Because you mentioned that there may be women, maybe not, but what were the issues that they had?
A lot of times, some of it was women.
Okay.
Sometimes it was just general politics,
Oh,
or other kinds of theological issues. So the ordination of women or LGBTQ people reflect theological distinctions.
mhm.
And it may be a whole raft of those theological distinctions. How much importance do you, how do you interpret the Bible, for example? Things like that. And so they've kind of coalesced around what gets referred to in the I don't want to say the inner circle, in the crowd of Episcopalians, is they get referred to as the ACNA, not acne, but the ACNA, ACNA, the ACNA Christians. There's also a group, and this goes back to one of the things I was saying about folks from Africa being sent here, AMIA, the African Mission in America, where people are coming in from Africa, where their theology is very, very different because of their history. And they're where they are. I don't want to be patronizing or anything like that, but the worldview is different than the Western world.
Right.
And so how do you try and hold this loose confederation together? And sometimes it doesn't work very well. If you think about some African countries where demon possession is still demon possession, and here it's a psychological disorder. I mean, how do you talk about these kinds of things, and what do you believe about them? It's just a challenge, and the church is facing this. We're dealing with it every day as we try and move forward in mission together. So,
Thank you.
any other questions on that before I move forward? So here are the member churches. And this, I think, is just really helpful to see. If you look over on the left-hand side, you see that this is old. I think I couldn't find a more up-to-date map. So this, I think, dates to 2008. So in 2008, there were 2.3 million Episcopalians in America, 642,000 in Canada, 13.4 in Britain. But if you go there, you're not going to see that many Anglicans. But it's the state church. You're kind of born into it. And they haven't quite figured out. But if you go on the right-hand side and you go to the Sudan, 5 million, Uganda, 8 million, Kenya, 2.5 million, Nigeria, 17.6 million Anglicans.
Huh.
The number of Anglicans in these countries compared to the number of Episcopalians is overwhelming. And so right now in the Anglican Communion, if you noticed, the British just chose a new Archbishop of Canterbury. They chose a woman, Sarah Mullally. And then the big debate is, what does it mean to be in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury, especially if you're in a country that doesn't even recognize women's ordination? Or if if Britain has, as a nation, has legalized same-sex marriages, and you're an Anglican in Uganda who thinks that this being homosexual is a capital crime, how do you pull all of this together under the same big umbrella? And that is a debate that is going on literally today. I mean, March 2nd, 2026. These discussions are going on in Britain, all over the world. How do we hold together this communion when the majority of Anglicans now do not live in the first world? And we're trying to hold this together. The Methodists, well, I will say Anglicanism is not a denomination. The Episcopal Church is, but Anglicanism is this communion. The United Methodist Church is a global denomination. And so it's structured very differently. And so the decision that often gets made in the United States for the United Methodist Church filters down into other Methodist places, and they're having problems with that. And so within the last 5 or 6 years, the Methodist Church is split over issues primarily of the ordination or same-sex blessing. And so now they're having problems that we didn't have because we are mostly a bunch of national churches. Same thing is being felt by the Roman Catholic Church, universal church, right? Everybody's a Catholic. First world Catholics don't think the same as the third world Catholics, or even some second world Catholics. And they've got the Pope. So what does Rome do with these people that are over here on the left and these people over here on the right to try and hold them together? Does the church veer to the right and say, well, we're going to do this and then alienate the US and the other first world, or they go there and alienate the third world? This is just a huge issue, related to globalization. But so I show you this slide of the member churches across the world in terms of the Anglican Communion, to highlight what's happened with globalization, but also the heritage of colonialism. Because, of course, most of those places on these maps were colonies of the British at one time or another, and it's that heritage. And if you go to these countries, they all want to be Anglican because that's what they grew up with.
Sure.
And nobody wants to leave it. But how do you figure out how to be together? And those discussions are happening all the time. So in the US, we've divided the Episcopal Church into provinces. Geographical, where cooperation in ministry is basically the key. And it's based geographically, but population-wise. So you got this teeny little province 1, but if you think about all of the people that are in province 1, you've got this huge province 8, you take out LA, and you've got this huge province 8 geographically with about the same population as province 1, but all of this space. So we're in province 6, with all of these sort of upper mountain west to slightly west midwestern states. And the provinces do meet together, again, to talk about ministry in terms of common cause. When I lived in Berkeley, or in California, I was the provincial coordinator for all of the campus ministries in Province 8. So you look at all of those states and you think about all of the campuses. I helped coordinate campus ministry in all of those places.
That was a huge job. Look how
yeah.
many UC and Cal State schools there are just in California.
Yeah, but not all of them have campus ministries, but they certainly, there are many who do.
Wow.
Well, when I first started in that role, the national church budgeted so much money for campus ministry. And the people there thought, well, we'll be equal. We'll give everybody 1/8 of that amount of money. And so I forget, it was like $2,500. It wasn't very much money. And I raised my hand and I said, if you're up in province 1, you can drive to every campus in that province within 3 hours.
Right.
I can't even fly from campus to campus in 3 hours. And I said, why are we allotting the money in the same way? Because most of it goes to student support for conferences. And you all can get to a conference, you can take a bus, but we have to fly and do all that. And so they changed the way, at least at that time, they've changed the funding structure since. But based on that argument and the size of these provinces, they changed the funding structure. But right now we are in province 8 or province 6 of the national church. And you can look at province 5, which has Chicago and all of those places. You can look down in province 4 with all of the southern, you think of the Southern Episcopalians or the Mid-Atlantic Episcopalians. This is where the Episcopal Church was strong. And we're way out in the West where the Episcopal Church was all missionary.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's how we are structured nationally. We are governed.
I can't read what province 9 was. I couldn't read what province 9.
Okay, good. So province 9 are sort of, there's one exception. If province 8 doesn't show it, although it may be there in the type. No, it doesn't. Oh yeah, it does. If you look right to the right of the Roman numeral 8, you see this little thing that has an arrow sticking off to it. That says Taiwan. We have Episcopal churches in Taiwan.
Wow.
I never visited campuses in Taiwan. I did go to Hawaii. I never went to Alaska. That's the only state I've never been in the 50 states is Alaska. So province 9 are Episcopal churches that are mostly in Latin America.
Okay.
And so it's Colombia, Dominican Republic,
better now that
Ecuador, Honduras, Venezuela, Puerto Rico. So these are North American Episcopal churches.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are other places too that are part of the Episcopal Church, and they're kind of extraterritorial. The bishop for all of the armed forces, that's kind of a global position, but we have a lot of Episcopalians who are in the armed services. So anyway, good question. So how are we run? How is the national church run? And then we'll get to how the local churches run. Basically, the national church is run on a 3-year cycle by what is known as General Convention. And we, as a diocese in Colorado, elect deputies to go to General Convention and make decisions for the whole church. When the convention isn't in session, then the presiding bishop, who is now Sean Rowe, Sean, our presiding bishop, you hear him referred to, used to be Michael, our presiding bishop. So they're the ones that keep the church running between general conventions. So general convention is where all of the major decisions for the church are made in terms of what's a new prayer book, what are our social positions, what is our theology, who can be ordained, all of those kinds of things. Those are made at general convention by vote of the church whole. And basically it's voted on by the bishops in one house and the deputies, which is the priests and lay folk, in the other house. So it's a bicameral system. The same people who wrote the Declaration or the Constitution of the United States, most of them were the people who wrote the Constitution of the Episcopal Church. So they look very similar in many respects. And then there are what are known as the interim bodies. So these might be the people who are working on revising the prayer book. These are people who are working on ecumenical things. These bodies sort of help keep the church running between conventions. So our next convention is in 2027. The last convention we elected Sean Rowe as our presiding bishop. So it happens every 3 years. Actually, the last convention was in 2026, 25. I don't know. COVID messed everything up, messed up the 3-year cycle. So now I'm confused beyond the normal confusion. So this is a flow chart, and I don't expect you to look at it very long, but you can see how convoluted the reporting structures are for running this 2.5 million people denomination across the United States and some other countries. So as you see at the top, it's the General Convention that runs the church, basically. And then it deputizes various folks, presiding bishop, House of Deputies, House of Bishops. Then they come together. There's somebody who runs the General Convention, all of these kinds of things. It's an org chart, a complicated org chart, but an org chart nonetheless. So speaking of General Convention, every diocese elects a certain number of people, and I think it's 3 lay people and 3 clergy to go to General Convention. And they're called deputies. They vote, they don't represent anybody, they vote their own conscience when things come up for vote. So the Diocese of Colorado will send 6 deputies and some alternates, 6 deputies to the next convention, which will be in Phoenix. And half of those deputies attend Good Shepherd.
Wow.
Larry Hitt, who is also our diocesan chancellor, attends Good Shepherd, he and his wife Shelley. Deacon Nadine is going to go representing the diocese. And then Carla Shapansky is going to go representing the diocese. So half of the diocesan deputation, with the exception of the bishop, comes from Good Shepherd, which astonished us all when we heard the results of the election at the last diocesan convention.
Huh.
It was an election, there were, I don't know, I think 6, maybe 8 people who ran, and the 6 were basically all elected in the first 2 ballotings, maybe 3. If you came in number 7, then you were an alternate. Came in number 8, you were the second alternate. But Nadine, Larry, and Carla are all there as full deputies. So it's just astonishing for this little church down in Centennial. So anyway, I show that slide just to sort of show the complexity of how things happen. And if you see over there on the left of the slide, you'll see it says parishes with vestries. That's our governing body. Then they send people to diocesan convention. Diocesan convention sends people to general convention, but also all the way over to some of the other things. Larry, our chancellor, also sits on the executive council of the Episcopal Church. So he's on the vestry for the Episcopal Church nationally. So we know what's going on. If I want to know what's really going on, I'll say, Larry, off the record, what's happening? And he'll tell me. So it's just funny. It's just funny. So in the diocese, our chief executive officer is Bishop Kim, and that's a photo of her getting the call that she had been elected.
No.
So that's her in Virginia getting the phone call telling her that she had been elected bishop, and this was now like 6 years ago. So she, for those of you who don't know, certainly the first woman bishop for Colorado, the first African American. So big deal for us. And it wasn't a slam dunk, but it wasn't a highly contested. She was elected pretty quickly. And the way that the elections happen is that each parish, based on its size, will send delegates to the diocesan convention. Theoretically or technically, the delegates are supposed to represent the parish. They're not voting their own conscience. They're giving the votes of the parish to the convention. And then the clergy go. And so the bishop, when we elect a bishop, the bishop has to be elected by a majority of the clergy and a majority of the laity. So it's not a simple majority, it's a majority in both houses. And so often, and this was the case when Kim was elected, the clergy voted one way and the laity voted another way. And then it was shuffling those things out until they both got to the same side of the table. So, and Kim was who was elected.
So when the laity votes, do you distribute something at the service to tell about these people? Like how do the members know who to vote for?
So when there's a bishop's election, there will be a selection committee and a nominating committee, and then there will be proposed a slate of people. And then the candidates will travel around to the various geographical areas in Colorado and do what are semi-officially known as walkabouts. And they get questioned. They give their spiel to the people in these various regions, get questions. Slightly more cynical people will call it the dog and pony show. And I'll talk about this map in a bit. I showed it that. So they will go to these places. And then usually, and this is what happened at Good Shepherd, is that there were some conversations had with the church, with the congregation and the delegates to say, what's the mind of this congregation? Is the mind of the congregation candidate A, candidate B, candidate C? And then they went and voted in that direction. The clergy voted on their own. I mean, our interest is different. It overlaps, but we're electing our chief pastor. We're electing the person who is supposed to take care of us. And the laity are basically electing people who are going to take care of the diocese. Not that the clergy don't have the same concern, but, is this somebody that we can go and talk to? Is this somebody that is going to help us do our job? All of those kinds. So the concerns are a little different, which is why the clergy elect and the laity elect. And that both of them together say, this is who we want to take us forward. So in Colorado, just like in the national church, Colorado is divided up into areas, regions, we call them, where we can get together in smaller groups to engage in common mission. Colorado is really hard because the population is centralized, mostly between Colorado Springs and Fort Collins. With a stretch, you can take it down to Pueblo, but it's that Front Range area, and then you've got all of this other stuff to the west and to the east of us. There aren't as many Episcopalians out there. Population is concentrated in the Front Range, so is the Episcopal Church. But there are Episcopalians in Sterling, and there are Episcopalians in Lamar, and there are Episcopalians in Cortez. They're scattered all over in Grand Junction. So we've divided up, the church has divided up Colorado into these 5 regions. The Northwest, obviously, we are in the High Plains region, that pinkish magenta quadrant. But you can see that there's a heck of a lot of that quadrant that is nowhere near where we are physically. But if you look at Sangre de Cristo, the beige region down the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that there's a lot of distance between Colorado Springs and way down to the southeast corner. So it's just the nature of this diocese and the amount of people who are in the diocese who are Episcopalian. And so for us, there, down there in that square that says Denver, Aurora, Littleton, the difference between the dividing line between us and the Front Range region is the Platte River. So there's a church in Littleton. It's actually sort of in Columbine, the Columbine area, that's in the Front Range region, just 8 miles from Good Shepherd, and a lot further away from the other churches in the Front Range region, because the dividing line is the Platte. You have to make decisions, and how do you make decisions? And so that was how we do it. Of course, the clergy all know each other. We see each other at conventions and at clergy conferences. And sometimes there's a lot of work, especially in the city of Denver, a lot of work that assumes that people from the Front Range and the High Plains regions all have common cause in Denver because it's such a big metropolitan area. But when you get to, Ouray or Craig, or Steamboat or Fort Morgan, the connections are a little skinnier. But this is how we've chosen to do some common ministry and fundraising and things like that in this diocese. So I'm moving from the top down, right? We started globally with the Anglican Communion, down to the Episcopal Church in the United States, down to the diocese. Now we're going to come down to where the rubber meets the road, and that's the local congregation. And so people talk about a parish as opposed to a mission. How are we organized? A mission church is usually a smaller church that can't afford to run itself. And so it may be a church plant. Good Shepherd started as a church plant. It was a mission church of St. Timothy's. They said, we need a church in this growing area out there by Yosemite and I-25, although I'm not sure I-25 was there yet. And so they said, we're going to try and start a church out there. And they helped fund the founding of Good Shepherd. So that's what's known as a parochial mission. Then there are other churches that the diocese says, we need a new church in this area, and we are going to help fund that church until it can be self-sufficient. And so there's a new church down in Sterling Ranch by Chatfield that the diocese is helping fund, as are some of the regions. So there are diocesan missions and parochial missions, and the person who is in charge of those churches is known as the vicar. Vicar from the word vicarious, or standing in place of. Then there is the parish, which is financially self-supporting, and that's Good Shepherd. I don't know at what point we transitioned from being. It's a good question. We need to find this out, Heather. Part of best research coming up into the 50th anniversary. When did we become a full parish?
I'll make a note.
Financially self-supporting, and the person who is in charge of that congregation is known as the rector. So rector is derived from Latin, from rex or king. I love it. Vicar is the one who stands in the place of. So, the Pope is referred to as the vicar of Christ, the person who stands in the place of Christ. A vicar is the person who stands in place of the bishop or of the rector of the sending parish. The person who is in charge of an Episcopal parish is known as the rector. So that's my formal title. People will call me pastor, people will call me reverend, people will call me father, but my formal title is rector.
Okay.
Then we have a committee that is the board of directors. And in the Episcopal Church in parishes, that's known as the vestry. Heather is on the vestry. In a mission church, it's called usually because they're missions of the diocese, they're usually called bishops' committees. And so they're standing instead to rule or to administer the congregation on behalf of the bishop, with the vicar helping out. At Good Shepherd, I'm the chairman of the board, the chief executive officer, the president of the corporation that is Good Shepherd. In mission churches, that doesn't work in quite the same way. It's still the bishop that is in charge, but there's still a board. So confusing, yes. Questions on that?
I think it's a lot to take in, but I'm sure as time goes on, it'll all
Yeah,
sort
yeah,
itself
it's a
out.
lot to take in. Just so when you hear about mission churches or parishes, and you hear about rectors or vicars, maybe some of this will come back to you. There's
Yeah.
no test. I don't take a test at the end of tonight, just so you know. But you do hear about these things. And there's a church in downtown Denver, a Holy Redeemer, that's been around for a long time. It's down in Five Points. And it, because of the nature of the demographics, it has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. It became a mission. These things get talked about at diocesan conventions, so we understand. And now it's at a point where it can't, even with diocesan help, it can't support itself. So what happens when a church diminishes so far that even with diocesan help, it can't support itself? And so the diocese, Bishop Epting goes and helps out there once a month. But there comes a time in the life of some churches that, the doors have to be closed. And that's a decision that nobody makes lightly. And it's a decision that's made at the diocesan level, not at the parish level. So it's sad.
I was
All
just
right.
going to say, my parents live in Gunnison, and I'm pretty sure that they share a rector with Crested Butte. And I've also heard of kind of out on the Eastern Plains is Lutheran and Episcopal churches kind of combining.
Exactly. Good. Thank you, Heather. Yeah, so there are places in Colorado, there are more than one, where two or even three churches will share a priest. So that the small, especially if they're widely dispersed, so that these small congregations continue to do ministry. And the priest will come in once or twice a month, or maybe if they're close enough, priest will show up in the morning at one church, in the evening in another church. So, and when the priest isn't there, then the church does morning prayer. You can do that. So the priest comes in to celebrate communion. So you're talking about down in Gunnison and Crested Butte, same thing was going on up in Granby, Grand Lake, up in that area as well, where the priest would move around. And again, if you're close enough, you can do two churches in a day. But Colorado is pretty big, and it might not be that you can do it that way. So you live in one place, and maybe twice a month you go to another place to do that. Some clergy are really good at that. In the Methodist Church, they used to call them 2 or 3 point charges. We don't talk about it in quite the same language, but it's the same reality. So yeah. And then in some places, we have, because we're fully in communion with the Lutheran Church, that means that Lutheran clergy can serve in Episcopal churches and vice versa. If you happen to move to a town and you're an Episcopalian and there are no Episcopal churches, you can go to the Lutheran church, no questions asked, vice versa. And we have some churches in the diocese, I think there are 2 or 3, where they are Lutheran Episcopal congregations. And sometimes what will happen is it'll be an Episcopal priest will serve. When that Episcopal priest retires or goes to another parish, they'll be replaced by a Lutheran, and they'll just sort of go back and forth. Some churches will use the Lutheran Book of Worship on odd Sundays and the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer on even Sundays. You know, they figure it out so that they minister to both congregations. So the closest one that I know of is in Elizabeth, down east of Franktown, Colorado, Castle Rock, out in, is it Kiowa County? And that's the closest one that I know of, but there are a couple of others.
Yeah, Elbert
And I
County.
was going to say, and I know of some churches in the United States, not here, where they've partnered in other ways with Presbyterians, even though we're not in full communion with them. So anyway, go on, Heather. You wanted to ask another question?
No, I was just gonna say Elizabeth's in Elbert County. Sorry, city planner.
Okay. So see if we can work through some of this stuff. So how are we run? We are basically run through the Book of Common Prayer and what we call the Constitution and Canons. So our worship is governed by the Book of Common Prayer. That tells us how we pray, what order our services run in, what begins, what ends. But there's latitude in the Book of Common Prayer, and if you open it up, whether it's on Sunday or you look at one you have in your house, you'll see that there's regular print, and then there's a lot of small italicized print. And the italicized print tells you how you shall do things. The regular print says what you're supposed to say, but the italicized print tells you, do you have to say it? Or can you leave it out? Or, you need to do these various things. So we refer to that italicized print. Those are the rubrics. And it's called that because it was in the old books, it used to be printed in red, and red in Latin is ruber. So these are the rubrics, the red letter stuff. And there's a distinction in the rubrics between may rubrics and shall rubrics. Shall rubrics mean you got to do this. You got to say this. And may rubrics are, you don't have to, you can do something else. So at Good Shepherd, I'll just give you a really easy example. In the last 2 weeks, we have, after I break the bread, we have sung, O Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. For a long time, what we've said is Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us, therefore let us keep the feast. You can do either one. That's a may rubric. A lot of churches get stuck in one mode of doing things. And so when you change it, you say, we're changing it. No, you're just taking advantage of a may rubric. But that's how the Book of Common Prayer really governs how we worship. It is the governing book for how we worship. The outline of the faith towards the back of the book is sort of an outline. It's neither a shall nor may rubric because it doesn't have to do with how we worship, but it does sort of govern how we think and how we believe. And we talked about that a number of weeks ago. So that's the worship side. How we run ourselves is kind of the legal side. So like I said, I'm the president of the corporation. Andy Folkerth is the vice president. We've got a treasurer. That's the legal side. We are a 501c3 corporation. We have to operate within the laws. We have to be organized. We have to know how we're going to vote. We know how we're going to have to know how we're going to decide on who's going to be ordained. What happens if a priest or a bishop or a deacon starts spouting heresy? How do we deal with heretics, especially in the clergy? How do we defrock somebody? We figured out how to ordain them. How do we unordain them? These are legal issues. And then how do we run our business? How do we run convention? Basically, it's Robert's Rules of Order, but you got to say that, you know. So, you know, so that the matter of the first part and the matter of the second part are put in the first and second order, and moved and seconded, and there's the appropriate, So we've got all of that. So we have what is known as the Constitution and Canons of the Episcopal Church, and Larry Hitt, our diocesan chancellor, member of the parish, good attorney, knows this stuff backwards and forwards. And he functions on that committee at the national church. And because he's our diocesan chancellor, he has to be able to, if there's a question on rules of order at the diocesan convention, he has to know what the national canons say, as well as our local canons and constitution for the Episcopal Church in Colorado. So there are all of these rules by which we are governed. Every church denomination is governed by similar sets of rules. But just so you know, this is how we do this. And all of these are online. You can, if you're having problems sleeping, open the browser on your computer, Episcopal Church, Constitution and Canons, start at page 1 and see how far you get.
Right.
So that's how we're governed. What do we do? The mission of the church is to restore all people to unity with God and each other. So this is our mission statement. And of course, for a long time, mission was simply spreading the gospel. It was evangelism, telling people, to use a sort of a non-Episcopalian phrase, to come to Christ. Missions of the Anglican Communion, because the church followed colonialism, basically turned a lot of people into Anglicans as part of the colonial efforts of the English, of England. And then once sort of we recognized that it wasn't just about preaching the word, but doing the word. So missions took on hospitals and schools and all of those other ways of spreading, the healing work of Christ. It wasn't so much about creating churches as serving people in the communities in these sort of healing ways. And so once the church sort of stopped doing the evangelistic stuff and became more involved in the, I don't want to say social ministries, but hospitals, those kinds of things, a lot of fervor seemed to kind of fade away a little bit. Doesn't mean that the church isn't doing good work at all, but people are saying we should be doing evangelism. And so that's just a live question in the church as a whole. But what does evangelism mean in 2026? And as we move forward, it's a good question. There's no good answer for it. It gets spelled out in different ways in different contexts. And so, and what does that mean for Good Shepherd? And it's a very vibrant question right now as we think about what are we doing for our next 50 years. I mean, so we're thinking through this in a way that maybe some churches might not be, because they aren't at this interesting fulcrum in our history. So this is a really good and thought-provoking question for us. But in general, what we want to do is we want to live out our baptismal covenant. And that is the same regardless of how you're doing it. We want to proclaim by word and example the good news that God came into the world to bring us back into wholeness with God. How do we do that? We want to seek and serve Christ in all persons. That's what we saw in Christ, who, Jesus served everybody. He didn't care. We want justice and peace for all. How do we do that as part of our mission? How do we protect the rest of the creation? That's part of our mission. All of those, as part of our baptismal covenant, say this is what our mission is as we go out into the world. So discerning what those mean in each individual place's context is all part of that. And we will do it differently. I think about my role as a priest or as a rector. You know, I'm supposed to be a priest, a pastor, a prophet, and a teacher. And some of those come more easily to me than others. So, you know, that's just who I am. But you know, we have to figure out where our individual calling comes, and then we exercise that on behalf of the church in mission to the broader world. So I've got one more slide, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I want to see if there are any questions before we go there on all that other stuff that I've been talking about. It's a lot. Yeah, great Far Side cartoon from many years ago. A little boy in a classroom. Pardon me, can I be excused? My brain is full. One of my favorites. But any questions on all of this? A lot of stuff, and there were stuff in the books too. So. You want to know what's on the last slide. So the last slide is what's next. Episcopal 101 is set up to be a refresher course for people who went through confirmation class a long time ago or just are interested in seeing what's new. It's also an opportunity for people who are interested in the Episcopal Church and would like to say, this is where I belong, to get more information about that. So given who's here, you know, if there is a next step, it would be, do you want to be confirmed? Would one want to be received in the Episcopal Church? This would be if you are Roman Catholic or Orthodox or Lutheran. Or do you say, I want to reaffirm my baptismal vows? I understand things now that I didn't understand. You know, and I want to say yes again. This is not a sales pitch. I'm not, you know, this is just sort of if it's a question I have to ask at the end of this class. Because there are a couple of opportunities coming up for us to make a sort of a public statement that, yeah, I belong to the Episcopal Church, or I reaffirm the fact that I belong to the Episcopal Church, or I'm coming in from outside, I want to belong to the Episcopal Church. And those two opportunities, all of these happen in the presence of a bishop, because the bishop is the sign of unity in the church. And so at the end of April, Bishop Kim will make her visit, or she only comes a couple times or every couple of years. I got on her calendar earlier. I said, our 50th anniversary is coming up. I want you there. And she said, I'm there. So she'll be here on, April 26th. On May 30th, there is a regional confirmation at St. John's Cathedral for all of those people who didn't have the advantage of having the bishop there within a year. We often have people go to the cathedral. When the bishop comes to the church, we often have people who are received or confirmed or reaffirm their baptismal vows. Both of those are possibilities. None of them are a necessity. You don't have to refund your money or anything like that if you decide, no, I don't want to do that. But I just want to sort of throw that out to you, that if one of these options is something that you would like to pursue, then let me know. So we can make sure that we make the appropriate preparations. And I don't ask for any raise of hands now. I will contact you outside of this to see whether or not that's something you want to pursue. We had some folks, was it last year, maybe 2 years ago, who went through Episcopal 101. And they said, yeah, we want to do it. We don't want to do it at the cathedral. We'll wait until the bishop shows up. at Good Shepherd. Okay. We have other people who said, we want to do it now. And we went to the cathedral. Um, so, and sometimes folks from Good Shepherd, will accompany you to the cathedral and they'll stand up and say wonderful things at the cathedral. It's a great thing to be able to do it at the local church. But again, there's no pressure. I just want to explain to you what your options are if you want to avail yourself. And saying, nope, I got what I wanted, then I'm happy about that too. So, any other questions on this or anything else? And of course, you can always email them to me or see me or whatever. But um,
Well, I just appreciate your time and your commitment to us for these 6 weeks. It's been so helpful to learn more than I learned in my confirmation classes 30 years or 25 years ago. And I'm loving the book too. It's a nice compliment. I haven't quite finished the book, but that's because my work has been crazy.
that's all right.
But I'm working on it.
Yeah, well, that's okay. And thank you, Heather. But you
Mhm.
know, I was a convert. Okay, I think I said this at the beginning. I did not grow up in the Episcopal Church, so I went through something like this when I was in. Actually, I was at seminary when I went through confirmation. I was confirmed when I was in seminary, um, and but that was a long time ago. Now, close to 50 years ago. I was in seminary when the 1979 prayer book was being developed and printed. So I've been a part of this for a long time, and it is the church that I love. And it's rich and it's complex um, and challenging. But for me and for a lot of people, clearly, it's the place that speaks to our hearts and our minds in ways that other places don't. And it's sort of my personal um, testimony, is that for me, it is a heart and a mind place. It's not one or the other. And I love the worship that feeds the heart and some of the mind. I love the theology and the history that clearly feeds this piece up here. Um, and that works for a lot of folks. And for others, it doesn't, and that's fine. And there are places, certainly in the Episcopal Church, that are much more mind oriented and much more heart oriented. And we've got those in Denver as well. But for me, so your statement, Heather, your compliment, your comment, this is what I do. I'm a teacher at heart, and so to help get information out, help increase knowledge, all of that, that feeds me in terms of what my vocation is beyond being a priest. So, all right,
Well,
8:35. Any
Gary,
final words? Dagmar, you unmuted yourself.
I did. I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed this, particularly the history. I had never really known much about it, so I found that fascinating. So thank you for sharing. That was enjoyable. And it just makes me feel that I have made the right choice by making sure I'm going back to the Episcopal Church. So thank
Good.
you.
You're welcome. Yeah, history. When I first developed this, started working on this, when I came to Good Shepherd, the intersection, especially in English church history, but also sort of pre European stuff, where these artists and poets and all of the novelists, where their stuff intersected with how the church moves, and we often teach history in terms of dates and battles and dead people, and all of that sort of stuff. And then there's all this other stuff. Well, this happened at the same time. You mean there might be some connection? And that was just such an eye opener for me when I was doing some of this in preparation for this stuff, 7 or 8 years ago when I taught the first one. And that's what makes it fun, is to realize, oh, this happened then. Now, oh, I get that. Now I see why Shakespeare wrote this, or I
Yeah.
see, what's his name and Pilgrim's Progress, where this fits in, and it makes things much more full, I guess. So
Well, Gary, we appreciate it.
good.
We came to Good Shepherd and well, Brad went first and really liked it.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, we need to kind of know more about it. And I feel like we do. So thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
Then it was a win-win-win-win-win. So
No, it was for me.
great. Anyway, y'all take care. Have a good evening. We'll see you soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.